Welcome to Real Rockford Files, for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'll be sharing Bigfoot stories. Let's get into it. Story 1. The province of Darien, located to the southeast extreme of the Panamanian territory bordering Colombia. It has an extensive rainforest and many different Indian cultures of Afro-Saharan descent brought into the area originally by the Spanish. Then there is Panama's sultry Darien Gap. It's a 10,000 square mile swath of stinking, impenetrable jungle on the border of Central and South America, known through the ages for swallowing explorers. Today, the contrabandista guerrillas, drunken men with machetes and broken bottles, line the thoroughfares with drug smugglers and poachers. If those don't get you, the large population of jaguars and deadly bushmasters will. This is one of nature's untold no man's land. Marsh's story of the man-beast of Darien follows. In 1920, while I was in Panama, an old and experienced American prospector, Shay by the name, came to me with a strange story. He had just returned from a trip to southeastern Darien with another American he had ascended the Sambu River with, which enters the sea on the southern shore of San Miguel Bay. The country here was, and still is, wholly unknown. Even the mountain range back from the coast did not appear on the maps. Shay and his companion worked their way with great difficulty to the headwaters of Sambu, and there they became separated. The other American has not been heard from since. When Shay lost his companion, he lost his canoe and most of his equipment. So instead of attempting to return down the Sambu River, he decided to forge his way to the Pacific Ocean across the Andean Range to the west. He reached the divide in a state of exhaustion, and by a stroke of luck stumbled on an old Indian dugout abandoned on the bank of a small river running into Pinus Bay. It was nearly dark, so he camped for the night at a considerable altitude not far from the divide. All that night he heard the footsteps of a large animal in the jungle above his camp, and when dawn came, he heard a curious chattering sound. He looked up and saw standing on top of the bank an animal that appeared to his unscientific mind to be a cross between a black person and a gigantic ape. It was 6 feet tall, walked erect, weighed possibly 300 pounds, and was covered with long black hair. It was glaring down at him and chattering its teeth in rage. Shay whipped out his revolver and shot it through the head. It tumbled down the bank and lay still beside his canoe. When Shay recovered from his fright, he measured the animal crudely. It was heavily built like a gorilla, but the big toes on the feet were parallel with the other toes, as in a human being, not opposed like thumbs, as in all other monkeys and great apes. Unfortunately, Shay was too exhausted to bring any part of the animal back to the civilization. He barely managed to get down to Pinus Bay on the Pacific and attract the attention of a coaster, which took him to Panama, more dead than alive. I saw him many times after that in the hospital, where he eventually died of chronic malaria. Almost his last words were a solemn oath that the story of the man-beast was true. Of course, my first reaction to this story was extreme skepticism, but I found to my surprise that many trustworthy men who had penetrated into the little-known parts of tropical America did not share my disbelief. The man-beast is reported to have been seen in many locations. A Spanish gold hunting expedition in the 17th century reported that it had shot 14 of the man-beasts not far from his same Pinus Bay. The Indians from Ecuador to Nicaragua assert that the creatures inhabit isolated jungle-covered mountains, as do the gorillas in Africa. Nothing will persuade an Indian to spend the night on such a peak. When I returned to Washington and mentioned the matter to Dr. Who of the Smithsonian, I did not get the pitying smile I was expecting. On the contrary, he said he had been getting reports of this sort for 20 years and was inclined to believe there was something in them. Story 2. My name is Morn Rat, and I wish to share with you my encounter with, I shall say, an ape man in Thailand. This totally surreal, baffling, but unique experience happened when I was 6 or 7. I'm now 35, but remember every single detail like it happened yesterday. In a tiny village in southern Thailand called Phai Bun in the county of Nakhon Sri Thammarat, Phai Bun is tiny, just a handful of houses on wooded stilts. A temple and a river ran behind the houses. One day while visiting my cousins, I lived in the neighboring village of Klong Chandi, I noticed that a crowd had gathered outside one of the houses a few doors down from where I was. I knew that house also served as a coffee shop. I witnessed to this day something that I never thought I would ever share with strangers, for fear of people thinking I'm crazy. I saw perhaps 4 Thai soldiers, and 2 of them had what looked like a long leash, which led to handcuffs, and then 2 ape-like creatures. In detail, they were tall, must have been 6 foot, walking upright like us, had dark fur, same color as a chimpanzee, features of a chimpanzee, but the eyes like humans. I know it sounds corny, but the only accurate way to describe them is that they look like the creatures from the Planet of the Apes. They seemed to be both male, though I couldn't be 100% sure, but the soldiers dressed them in jeans and long-sleeved blue shirts, if I remember correctly. They were sipping hot, sweet tea with a small spoon like a human. There was a crowd around them. They didn't seem too bothered. To me, it seemed like they were used to the attention. They didn't act like how I presume an ape would act. I would say they leaned more towards the human side in their behavior. I was too young then to ask what or who they were. I suppose due to the initial response of the villagers, it was their first time to have witnessed them too. I remember that some of them asked the soldiers questions, but I can't recall what was said. I asked my cousins about them too. They don't know anything about it. The 2 ape-like creatures seemed like they were used to humans. This is looking back. They didn't seem to mind us crowding around them. As I said, they were sipping Thai tea, which served in a glass cup. They knew how to pick up a spoon, stir tea, then spoon the tea into their mouths rather than picking it up and drinking it. I presume they must have been captured for a while. They seemed to be at ease around us, though barely took notice of us. They wore clothing, they walked like us. They were not huge, not gorilla-like in their physique. No big heads, no huge shoulders like some of the pictures I've seen while researching on the net. They were like men with a chimpanzee mask, or half man, half chimpanzee is the best way to describe them. I do remember that they didn't seem to have hair on their face, maybe around the face frame and the protruding ape-like mouth. Human-like eyes, dark, but it was the eyes I remembered the most. I remember vividly seeing pain in one of their eyes. Their hair was black because they had a long-sleeved shirt and jeans on. You can only see so much. The crowd had packed into this tiny shop, and I remember the room was dark from the many bodies straining to see them. Who knows where soldiers were taking them or what they were doing with them. I went back to the village of Phai Bun for the first time after many, many absent years in 2004, and sadly a lot of the houses had either been flooded away or had been burnt down by a wildfire that happened many years ago. My cousins still keep in contact with some people from there. I shall do my utmost to find out about them. I made a promise to myself to find out about my friends, wherever they are. I will be going back again next year, so I shall keep you updated. Also, they must have come from an army base nearby. Someone out there knows them. Hope the info helped. I do feel better having shared this experience with people. Though my husband loves me very much, I think he gave me a very funny glance when I told him about it. Few people that I can share this with, and who better than those who believe it too. The soldiers didn't seem threatened or bothered by them. After drinking their tea, they left. I remember watching one of them sip his tea with his spoon. The sad look in his eyes I'll never forget. Never. To this day, if I could find them again, I would want to free them. Goodness knows where they came from, what happened to them, but I do know that the Thai army had something to do with it. We are talking about a tiny little community in the deepest, thickest part of the southern Thailand. No one would have the money to pay for a practical joke like that. Though I never thought of researching to see if there was an army base nearby, somebody out here knows about them. Sadly, I feel that perhaps they were killed, as I have not heard anything about them anymore, but who knows? I pray and hope not. Story 3. My name is Nicholas McCain. I grew up in Dixie, Washington, and am now 23 years. My story takes place about a year and a half ago. It was early August when my friends invited me to go camping for a weekend with them. The place was in the Umatilla National Forest, about 3 miles past Jubilee Lake. Motet Campgrounds is in Oregon. It's a beautiful area and plenty of places to go hiking. Later in the evening, after eating a great meal of venison, elk, and moose a friend brought, which may have very well helped get their attention on the last day, it was just my friends Jordan, Josh, and I still awake around the fire with a number of people sleeping around in their tents. I was resting on a cot about 5 feet away from the fire and about 20 feet away from the edge of the woods that the soon coming noise would come from. It was somewhere around 11:30 p.m. Jordan gets up from his chair and walks over to the edge of the tree line nearest me to relieve himself. In the middle of doing so, there was a sudden growl, snorting noise that came from about 15 yards into the trees. This was enough to cut off Jordan in midstream and run backwards to the fire. Josh and I were on our feet within the blink of an eye, and I, without even realizing it, grabbed my knife off to my side. All of us pretty much at the same time started looking at each other and started to question as to whether or not we all heard the same thing and what the F could that possibly have been. We all grew up in a little town of Dixie, only a couple of miles from being right in the blues, and we were all well aware of what kind of animals to expect, having spent many nights in the mountains. We were not impaired in any way, having partied a little too hard the last few nights and having to be up early to leave the next day. After about a minute, Jordan and I ran back to our tent to grab the machete and the big flashlight. We inspect the woods as best we can from about 5 feet in. After seeing nothing right away, we started smacking trees and yelling, basically making a hell of a racket in case it was a cougar or something. We figured whatever it was would run away if we made enough noise and whatnot. After doing that, we made the fire up a bit bigger and made sure to have some branches sticking out just in case we had to throw them. We all calmed down after about 20 minutes or so and went back to regular chit-chat. An hour and 15 minutes goes by, and out of nowhere, and from the same spot we heard the last noise, we hear a roar and a sudden smashing of what sounds like large hammers on wood and tree branches violently snapping, and a thud, 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 and then complete silence. In about 6 thuds that we were able to hear, it traveled about 35 to 40 yards. While this was happening, we all stand back up and start screaming, "What the F? What was that?" So on and so forth, not willing to even go near the edge of the woods. One of the people sleeping in the tent nearest to everything comes bolting out, squealing her head off and freaking out, wanting to know what was going on as well. This was enough to get the guy with the 44 out of bed and whatnot, but by the time he was there, nothing really left he can do. A good half an hour goes by, and he finally goes back to sleep, as well as Casey, the one who was sleeping nearest to the ruckus, and the 3 of us go back to sitting around the fire. 20 minutes later, we hear the sounds, like a thud, 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 only further away in the distance and walking away. We at that point are exhausted and decided to go to sleep. It just so happens that we all were sleeping in a 4-person tent, and it just so happens that the zipper on the door was broken, so it was flapping open all night and day long. When we awoke the next day, all 3 of us had about 2 to 5 pine cones around our heads. I know the door on the tent was broken, but there's just no damn way we all dragged in that many pine cones all the way by our heads. I found a very large footprint outside our tent, and when examining the area where all the noise had happened the night before, there were two 10 to 15 foot trees broken in 2 spots as if something had grabbed it with 2 hands and bent it over with ease. From here forward, I know that Bigfoot exists, and although that was as scared as I've ever been in my life, I must go back and search. One day, one of us who believe will get that proof we've all been searching for. Story 4. This happened 30 years ago at age 5, while camping with my sister and parents at Salt Creek Falls, Oregon, on Highway 58 just past the tunnel. A large being sat down on our campsite and ate some chicken out of a bucket we'd left out. This was in the middle of the night. My parents were sleeping in a nearby tent, and my sister and I were on cots out in the open. As I said, I was 5 years old, and my sister was 10. The next morning, my sister and I were out exploring and playing on the lava flows. Something scared my sister, and she pushed me down and ran. I suffered a gash to the side of my head. Someone or something picked me up and carried me like a baby. He or it carried me back to the campsite and placed me on my cot. My parents weren't there, and when they came back from looking for me, they asked me how I found my way back. I told them a bear carried me back. I told them that it walked, carrying me in its arms. I remember that it was all hairy and wore no clothes. It looked like the same thing that was eating the chicken the night before. Haven't seen anything like this since. I'll leave it to you, but looking back, I think it was a Bigfoot. Maybe it would have been worthwhile to check the area for other sightings. Story 5. My name is Eric. I would like to post this that I read somewhere else about a Bigfoot that was sighted in Burrillville, Gloucester State Forest in Rhode Island. At around 2 in the morning, a student decided to pull into George Washington State Park. He got out to sit and relax because his truck was too old for air conditioning. It was in the summer of 2002 when he heard some grunts, yells, and heavy footsteps coming toward him. He soon thought it was time to go, so he got back into his truck. At the same instant, when he opened the door, he smelled a horrible smell like a wet dog or a rotten egg type smell. Anyways, he pulled further into the park to turn. When he got halfway down the dirt road, he saw what looked like a reddish-brown, furry human walking directly in front of him. It looked totally like an ape that was walking upright like a human. This scared him so much he took off home. I wanted to tell you this report because I live extremely close to the park. The only difference is that I live on the Burrillville side of the forest instead of the Gloucester side where the sighting has occurred. There is also a number of trails that go through the state park, and I have hiked half of the trails. There is one trail that I hiked that it went into Connecticut. Very cool trails. But during some of these hikes that I go on, I feel like someone is watching me, even though there is hardly anyone there. Anyways, I get very nervous at some point when I'm out there in the woods, but after a while it would go away. I also wanted to let you know I'm a firm believer in Bigfoot and want to support other Bigfoot websites and stories so people can pass them on to the next person. Story 6. I live in the town of Kalama, which is located on I-5 in Cowlitz County of Washington between Kelso and Woodland. Kalama is named after a Hawaiian man who came here and married the daughter of a Nisqually chief, or so the story goes in these parts. Small towns always have stories. As a lad, I worked at the local fish hatchery, but I'm retired and on disability now and would appreciate my name not being used. I want to relate a second-hand story that was told to me, probably not factual, but persistent. The story goes, there was a man present in the Kalama saloon, I won't name the bar, when suddenly a wild-eyed and scared Washington State Fisheries employee rushed in and asked for a double shot on the rocks. This Washington State Fisheries employee, not me, but someone I know in this town, said the man in the bar worked at the Kalama River Fish Hatchery, that I would know his name. For the sake of the story, I'll call him Joe. Joe had been enjoying his days off by camping alone on the upper Kalama River, which is beautiful country, pristine in places. On his first night, Joe built a campfire and gathered firewood in preparation for spending several days in the area. Not long after the sun went down, He heard movement in the nearby underbrush, just outside the ring of light provided by the campfire. According to the story, this man we refer to as Joe said he could hear grunting, heavy breathing, and sounds of tree limbs being broken off or snapped off. He could also hear heavy footsteps, but never saw anything. He kept feeding his campfire more wood. He told folks that he was firmly convinced that keeping the fire going all night had saved him. He stayed awake through the night, with the intruder leaving just before dawn. At first light, he got on his trail bike and left for Kalama, leaving behind his tent, sleeping bag, his tackle, and other top-notch gear. They asked him if he was going back for his camping equipment, said to have been some expensive gear, but Joe replied, no, they could have it. Now, I would believe this to be a bear or elk story, were it not for the number of huge barefooted footprints that were found, 12 to 14 inches long, half as wide, and very human-like. 2 Kalama men went to the area to retrieve Joe's camping gear for him, say they found these tracks, which left them troubled. In addition, they found broken off tree branches, some 2 inches in diameter, that was some distance above the ground, which could have been done by bear cubs up a tree were it not for so many of them been broken. They returned Joe's gear to him, and to this day he's never been back. Odd for a fellow known to be a woodsman. That's it, probably just a bar story. Nobody knows for sure when this occurred. The story has been around for years.